Welcome to Anglo-Romani with Pricey. I'm Pricey, and this is the series where I take a look at the Anglo-Romani paralanguage / dialect that I grew up with in my family and use it as a lens for kind of looking at the changes to the Romani language generally as it migrated from east to west towards the UK. In today's video, I am once again looking at body parts, names for body parts. I probably will be wrapping it up, but I will mention that I went to visit my family yesterday and it was a very enlightening conversation with the lot of them, especially my oldest sister. And this series may have some way to go yet before I wrap it up eventually. So let's get into this. Okay, so kicking things off with a nice simple quick one today. Vast, meaning hand. This one seems to be used by quite a lot of families across the UK, and it doesn't seem to have changed that much from its point of contact in the continent either. If it's not vast, then it's vasta. They just put that extra sort of a sound on the end. And this really hasn't changed much from its Sanskrit origin point of hasta, or Saraceni Prakrit hata is kind of I guess closer in terms of time, but yeah, hasta in Sanskrit becomes vasta in Romany and vast in Anglo-Romani. Hasta and hata sort of evolved in the continent, it seems, and it has cognates in Gujarati, Mewari, Sindhi and Nimadi. Considering that it's usually one of the first things that people notice about me, I've left this one quite late. But that's because I didn't really use this word growing up. No, it kind of rang a bell when my dad mentioned it, but I still had to ask him, oh wait, Val, what's that one again? And he'd tell me it's hair. Val is kind of interesting in its own way because it comes from the continental Romani bal, and this goes back further to bala, and then that in turn goes back, like many of these words, to the Indian subcontinent. But then when it arrives in the Indian subcontinent, going backwards, the word that they used was actually vala, so like a V sound instead of a B sound. I know, like, for example, if you have ever tried learning Spanish, like these have very similar sort of placement in the mouth, actually in Japanese as well, where like the B and the V can kind of be interchangeable. So I think that's what's probably happened here. It started with a V sound, became a B sound, and then when it arrived in the UK, reverted back to a V sound pretty much coincidentally. And like I just said, this word can be traced back to the Indian subcontinent with the Sanskrit and the Saraceni Prakrit vala. And much like the last word that I just mentioned, this one also has contemporary cousins in today's languages. Punjabi in particular seems to use this word, either val or vala, I can't remember which, while Hindi uses the closer to the Romani sounding, like continental Romani sounding, bal. This next word I had absolutely zero awareness of growing up, and that is Dumma, meaning your back. In a lot of contemporary Anglo-Romani families, it seems that Dummo is used, or Dummo, or something along those lines, and this is something that is also reflected in continental Romani. So our family's kind of the outlier in putting an a sound on the end, but looking back further, this one kind of took me in a bit of a circle as far as its origin point was concerned, because this either goes back to the Sanskrit word dumba, meaning either tail or rump, or potentially it is borrowed from a very early Persian word dum. So either Sanskrit or maybe a later language, I imagine a later language, got it from an early version of a Persian word dum, or the Persian word came from the Sanskrit. I really went round in circles trying to figure out which one was the true origin point with this word. But in any case, this word either means tail or rump, I think, depending on various contexts. But as I've mentioned, this word is used to refer not to the tail or rump, but specifically the back of, I guess, a human or an animal. And that's how it's used today in Anglo-Romani. Another word that all of my family use is Peedi, referring to foot. Now, this one is one of those words where, from my perspective as someone who's learned a little bit of a lot of different European languages, this one always felt quite European to me. The French word for foot is Pied. There's a D in there. I think it's Piede is Italian. The Corsican word has a similar sound, and then you've got the Baltic languages of Latvian and Lithuanian that have Peda, so they all have this kind of p sound, and so I always felt like it was something that would be picked up from a more closer geographic sense than, say, something in sort of the Indian subcontinent. Well, I might be onto something, but then there also might be a bit of a link. Let me explain. The more commonly used word, it seems, at least according to the Romany project done by Yao and Mattress at the University of Manchester, seems to be Piro or Piri, one of those sort of two sounds, and this in turn can be linked very easily to the continental Romany Piro. And so you have this very distinct pr sound with a R instead of a D, but kind of like with Val earlier, the R and D can have a similar placement in the mouth, and so there is that potential link. However, what I think is more likely to have happened is there was this word meaning foot that had come through from more earlier origin points of the Romany language, and someone, at least in my ancestry, probably got the similar sounding piede or something like that, maybe from Italy, and the two things ended up getting blended together. As far as etymology is concerned, this one goes back via a few minor morphisms to the Sanskrit pinda. Personally, I quite like it when I come across these words where I'm looking at a word from an ancient Indian language and I'm seeing its connections with an ancient European language, and so the pinda, or in some things I'm reading the word pad from Sanskrit, seems to have a common ancestor with the ancient Greek pous, also meaning foot, and I think it's pods is the Proto-Latin thing that I'm finding here, but there definitely seems to be a common ancestor for all these different sort of old world languages regarding the foot. In the last video where I talked about body parts as part of this series, I mentioned the words Corey and Minge, two words for the nether regions that I happen to grow up with. I didn't really grow up with the knowledge of what your backside or anus, one of the two, probably either or, interchangeably, was going to be, but my dad was able to inform me quite easily, bull. And it seems this one is a very commonly used word across a lot of Anglo-Romani families. This word breaks the usual trend I have when I'm talking about nouns in particular, because it hasn't really changed that much from the continent to the UK in how it's used and how it's pronounced, and bull seems to be just a very common word across the entire continent for the backside, like the anatomy, the bum, buttocks, whatever you want to refer to it as. However, I am now convinced that it might refer specifically to the anus, at least historically, because of where my research led, which is the Sanskrit word bulli, meaning anus and vagina. I don't know if that's like just a colloquial thing that I don't really want to get into, or if people imagine themselves having cloacas. One thing that is kind of interesting about this is that I wasn't able to trace this back very far at all, and like Sanskrit really is kind of the end point for it. But once I started looking in other languages, I was able to find that this word has been borrowed by Hungarian slang, and I think also potentially Romanian slang, to refer to the anus or the vagina. I can only imagine that's because of a high concentration of exposure to the Romany language, and this very crude aspect of the language got picked up and used by just typical people, by gorgers effectively, much the same way as how minge is used in the UK, so colloquially. And finally, I'm going to finish today's video on a word where I actually do have at least a little bit of a personal story and a personal take on it. When I was about 14-15 years old, I worked for this guy who he kind of basically did like advertising agency stuff for various circuses and fun fairs, and so he was involved in the publicity of it, and that's what my first job was. The reason I got into this work is because this guy, even though he's a gorger, is one of my dad's oldest friends, and when they were both very, very young, they were best friends with each other. I think he came from like Nantwich or Congleton or something, which was the area where my dad used to sort of move around a lot in when he was still living in the traditional lifestyle with his family, and this guy lived like in a countryside cottage or something when he was a kid, and they were about similar age. Anyway, because of the many years that they spent around each other, this guy picked up a lot, probably more so than I picked up in my childhood, of the language. And so one time I'm at this guy's house, and I can't remember, he was moving something like some piping or something like that, and he told me to watch my Lerra, and I kind of looked at him blankly, and my dad was in the vicinity and he said leg. I was like how is this guy know more than like anyone in my I've heard from, not just my dad but like the rest of my family, was kind of the feeling I had at the time. But I will say that my interpretation of this word Lerra, meaning leg, was it was some sort of lazy codification of an English word just to sound a little bit different. Well, it's not the first time in this series, and I'm sure it won't be the last time, where I've thought that about a word, where I thought, oh, this has clearly come from the English, and no, it's come from somewhere a lot further back in the Romany migration. However, the difference being that in my family, the word Lerra is used, and in a lot of other families, according to Yaron Matras at least, the word era is used. So just missing that first consonant sound. In any case, Yaron Matras links this back in various works of his to the continental Romany. I want to pronounce this right, but I'm not going to, so I'm just going to pop it on the screen and try. Ero or Eroi. I'm not sure how we're pronouncing like the H and the J in this. And this word that I'm struggling to pronounce apparently was linked back to the Sanskrit and Prakrit word hada, meaning bone. I was really struggling to see how the Romany word hero or eroi was related to the Prakrit and Sanskrit hada. They sound very different from each other, until eventually I came across a Damari term that was used as a kind of bridge, which was ha, and this harder sound seems to have carried through at least to sort of the Levant region, the sort of Middle East, before Romanese softened it and carried on using a similar word. So I'm guessing like hada became ha, and then that became hara or something like that, and then we end up with era, Lerra in my family. But what is interesting is that I've gone this entire time, what I've been doing this for now, like 18 episodes or so, and this is the first time that I'm mentioning, since looking at the word Romany itself, the Damari people. So I haven't really touched on these guys too much apart from that one mention. Effectively, this seems to be another group with a very similar origin point to Romany people. In fact, it seems that the Romany people originated with the Dom people, and so did the Damari, who are much closer, had a much closer name with. It's hard to say what the timeline is exactly, but my guesstimate would be that the Romany people kind of migrated out first because they went into Europe and beyond, whereas the Damari people sort of stuck around specifically in the Levant region. And it turns out that in Israel, for example, this is the group of people that are referred to as gypsies. So, they have a lot of similarities with the Romany people, but there's also enough differences to work out that these are completely different sort of clans, tribes, if you will. And so yeah, it was just really interesting that this word that I thought clearly came from a bastardized English word ended up taking me on a journey that linked back to the Damari people, a group of people very closely related to Romanis. Now, I still don't know too much about, but I'm now just starting to learn. And with that, there's the rest of the body parts that I'm going to be mentioning in their own separate video as part of this series. Like I say, more might become known to me over time, and I'll include those in other videos, but that's going to be it for body parts. If you haven't watched the body parts part 1, then do go check that out, as well as the rest of this series, which I'm going to be making for a little while longer, it seems. And feel free to check out the rest of my channel if you're into retro gaming, if you're into music discussion, if you're into concert vlogs, that kind of thing, occasional chess. And until next time, have a good one.